All right, so here we have the Effect House randomizer, and let's just see what it does real quickly, and then we'll kind of go through everything. We'll just get this started. Which dog are you? Very standard randomizer, 2D randomizer so far. Vizsla, nice Hungarian breed. So not too different from the generic 2D randomizer you see when you open up Meta or Meta or Effect House. But that's kind of to my point, which is that sometimes simple is better. Like a lot of AR effects that are on the simpler, kind of cute, fast, fun side are the more evergreen and kind of sought after effects. People, not always, but typically don't want to spend forever on AR effects. They're kind of designed for short term engagement most of the time. And in the real world, even though it might be simple, it can still be of high value. It just depends on who you're working with and for yourself. Like maybe you just want to take these templates, put your own assets in, and you'd be perfectly happy with that. And I would love that. And that would correspond to what my experience has been in this industry so far. But let's go through everything real quick here, and then we'll spend most of our time in this node graph area. And I'll pause this just in case I don't, just so that I don't constantly have a dog barking at me when I reset things if I do. So here we have our hierarchy, and you'll see it's just about holders of elements that you're going to see when a random option is chosen. So you have your which dog are you title here, which is just a texture which you can replace with your own. And then you just have stickers here, and you'll see there's a strange delineation right here between stuff. That is because when this file was first created, there was a older version of Effect House in use, and when I upgraded, I couldn't do things the same way. And I've kept this intentionally to show you what can happen with your projects when we're still in kind of a beta state with these platforms. But you can still work around it, and you can still work with it and still get what you want. So functionally, even though you can kind of ignore this organizational difference, it's still doing the same thing, even though it seems different for these three remaining options, but it's not. And then you have this, which is this, the actual circulating sprite, which is this. And that's just a big shift select of images when importing from computer. So import from computer, and then just shift select a bunch of individual images, and it will pull it in for you. It'll say, oh, okay, this is a sprite sheet. So easy, you don't have to build a sprite sheet in advance. Love it. The rest of these textures are, the paw is just a random texture that's in some of these results. And I did SM underscore in the name of the pooch, just for ease of visually. I'm like small dachshund. Oh, that's because it's just one of the little stickers that shows up. So nothing too special going on here. We're just toggling visibility on and off from a random option container. And that gives us our result. And we stop at a corresponding time in our text sequence here. So now let's take a look at our node graph here. Very standard from what you've seen from the template randomizers if you've looked at those. But let's go through it real quick here. First thing to notice is that we've got 10 options, but that option count I've placed is 9. Why is that? Well, because in programmer speak, we are dealing with an array of options, a bunch of elements that we're all kind of have together, and we want to go through that list or collection and pick one. And in programmer speak, the first element of an array is actually 0 and not 1. So it's the 0th element is the first element. So the option count minus the actual number of options you have minus 1 is the count that you want. In this case, 9. 0 through 9 is 10. Should tap to spin work? Tapping, should it activate? How long should it spin for? 5 seconds. How long should you delay before starting? 1. How long should it take to fade out? 1.5 seconds. So those are preset variables. And you'll see that's just set right there on the object. And then when we drill in, our subgraph variables have places where we can change it. But what we're doing is making that we're making this an easy place to do some initial setting for what you might like for your effect. And then when we come in, we see that this data just flows into this initialization for each of these variables. Okay, so there's a pulse that flows out through here. Make sure this is active. It is pulling in the value that it sees from here. This value here, that 5 that we saw earlier, time 1, 1.5. Okay, so we're pulling that data in that we pre-configured outside in the main graph into the subgraph. Now we've got that data here. And this is kind of the first section. We've not quite started yet. We're just initializing things. And to avoid some visual clutter, I've grouped the initial setting and visibility of all this stuff into this group. So if we drill in, we see it's all the same. We're just setting the visibility to off by having this unchecked for the master stickers element and for all the corresponding elements, the text sequence and all of the options, just all the way down. All the way down. But in Effect House, that green piping, those node connections are really important to kind of all string together. TikTok really tries to enforce that your data kind of isn't too branched out and working concurrently. They want you kind of one thing triggering the next thing, like the structure of their node graph strongly encourages that kind of design. So we toggle the initial visibility of everything off except for our which dog are you, the intro. And we'll see that in a second, okay? Making sure is tap is activated. Also screen tap. We're making sure that is activated. So we've received a tap, and this is kind of a gateway in a way, because if this was checked off, then receiving the tap wouldn't do anything. And then we've got our tap to spin condition, which is checked in the main graph. So this is true and this is true. So we get a screen tap. This is active. This is already true. So we pass our if. And then we do a copy. This is a copy of this. Drill in real quick here. Making sure everything is set off. All of our options. Can't see it. Nothing's happening to them. Their visibility is just set off. So this is now we've hit our initial gate. Everything has been initialized so that we're just looking at our which dog are you? Okay. So we hit that. When we hit that, 2 things fire off. Okay. I just finished saying how TikTok tries to enforce you kind of do things sequentially, but they do have options for doing some things concurrently. The sequence is a part of that. So let's follow this sequence and follow this pipe here. And we see it is pausing a timer. Okay, so it's preventing anything from firing off right away. We need to wait a little bit once we've really started the effective experience so that people can actually read which dog are you. And then it can fade out and we can start seeing the sprite sequence. So while that timer pauses immediately, we also make sure that our title opacity is set to 1, which is 100%. So the opacity is all the way up. We can see which dog are you. And that means this part is going to pass, this part of the if. We also have these checks here to make sure that tapping or just letting the effect run are both active. And that will pass this gate. And now we have our title delay, which is a 1 second delay once we've really started. And now we're initialized. We're waiting for a second before we start cycling things. So we pass this. Now we start this. Okay, so this hits this first. This is waiting to start for this. And it's waiting for this amount of time to actually run. So it's waiting for a second and then running for a second and a half. So it's sort of a 2.5 second overall experience between when you first see which dog are you and when it totally fades out to show the animation sequence. So you can play with those values to change the timing. Okay. And then as this timer starts and ticks away, it subtracts 1 each tick to decrease the opacity of the title from 1 down to 0. Just show that real quick. And there it goes. Okay. Now, how do we pick which, there's our wolf, how do we pick where we stop in the sprite sheet? How do we kind of make that random and go from there? It's this sequence right here. And what we're doing is taking the time that we want things to actually seem like they're spinning through in the animation sequence and create a range, a lower and upper bound, and pick a random within that range. Okay, so if we want to run more or less 5 seconds, then we want to make sure our range is not too drastic, or else instead of being like a more or less 5-second spin, it could be like maybe it triggers like within 1 second, or maybe it triggers like within 10 seconds. That'd be just depending on what bounds you give it here. Okay. So the interplay of the variable value here and the bounds that you set here give you how big a range it's choosing. It's cycling through really fast. The FPS is fast enough that a small upper and a lower and upper bound will give you a decent amount of time to get a random result. Okay, so it's quite different from the meta option where we don't play with the sprite sheet at all. We just toggle it off altogether and then make our own random choice. So you see structurally they're actually quite different as far as how you get your option. In either case, this timer will end. And once it has started and completed, a couple of things happen. So once it starts, we're playing with this animation sequence controller that sprite sheet, the text sequence that's flying through. This guy is having this animation play through it. We're keeping track of the current frame number it's on. That's important, and that's how we'll ultimately make our decision. Okay, we're also taking in that index of how many total options do we have. In this case, 10, because remember 0 is an element as well. 0 is the first element. And we'll drill into this to a minute, but I'll come back to what happens when the timer completes. When the timer completes, we make sure that master sticker holder is on, and that these checks pass, okay, that we can trigger the audio, the woof, or whatever sound you're going to make. Okay, it's tied to that, it's going to play. And that is actually what sends us into this big switch. You see that? So nothing else is piping in to trigger this data flow that's coming into this switch. It's actually occurring through the audio controller. Based on this timer completes, we flow down and trigger this switch with data as it's cycling through its animation sequence about which frame number it's on. So you're carrying both into the switch, both, okay, activate, and where am I within this? Oh, I'm at option 8, which is actually the 9th option, which is the Shih Tzu. Oh, okay, everything's working fine. You see how that works? Okay. So you can always add more to your switch here if you need more options. And you can disconnect pipes here if you have fewer options if you want. And now let's look into these results and see what's happening when this gets executed. Come in here. Looks a little weird, maybe a little scary, but it's all structurally the same. So once you understand how one thing has data flowing through it, you can copy and paste and adjust values for your own stuff, and it should work fine. So your data flows out here, and it's got that pulse to start, and it's also carrying that index frame. So one of these is going to trigger based on that current frame in the animation sequence controller. It's going to flow out through its pipe, and it's going to turn on the visibility. Let's say it's option 0. Then this gets triggered, this first element. It gets its visibility triggered on, and then we have a sort of a variable that's kind of a gateway saying, okay, we can go. But there are some animation things that happen that I've buried in a subgraph here so that it wasn't too visually like this is already kind of an intimidating node graph. It's a lot of stuff. So that's why we sometimes bury the stuff in subgraphs, which create its own challenges. But it's sort of, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And what is your preferred style of looking at things? Okay, let's drill into the subgraph. There are two main things that are being controlled. We have the opacity of the sticker element, and we have the scaling. So it fades in and scales in. That's what's happening here for each sticker in each option. So we're not going to go through all of these because they're all just like this. It's just a difference of what scaling and what opacity for which element you're tied into. But the animation and the timing and all of this is all the same. So let's drill into this. So we get that pulse to start our timer. It's a 1 second duration, which you can adjust. Okay. And that, as it ticks through, for all of them, ticks down the opacity, or ticks up the opacity from 0, because they fade in. So the progress number flows into this and adds directly to the opacity value here. So over time, it will tick the slider up. And I have them all there right now. Their timing is all the same together for their opacity. So this one thing triggers the next, and they all get the same values. And that just goes out that way. Nothing more to do there. The opacity set. Likewise, our timer here has a much faster scaling element happening to it, which you could adjust there. As it ticks through, meaning as each frame progresses, we get the go-ahead to start taking these values in. And what this is kind of introducing an easing. So it's not just necessarily a straight linear motion as it scales in, but you can give it some easing based on playing with your math here. We have a lerp, square root, power, gets converted into a number, a vector 2 number, okay, which is relevant because these are 2D objects, so they are in the XY axis. So you need an X and Y value to flow in. And that will change your scaling. But this all happens basically at once, and we want to make sure that that's done now and we're good. So we make sure that we have an output, that we have a pulse going out saying, okay, we've pushed through all of this. Okay. So that takes us out. And now we get into this can pass trigger. I've been saying pulse and trigger fairly interchangeably because they are. And that's the world of working in both Meta and Effect House. Once any of these options are able to pass, they've triggered, they've completed their scaling and their opacity animation, then we are good to go. We've got the go-ahead. We've completed our cycle there. Okay, and then this triggers and lets us know that we can make sure that our resultant sequence is visible, stuck on the frame where it stopped. So hopefully that all makes sense. It's a little confusing to look at, and you blink and you miss it, but if you replay it a bunch of times, you'll see where each of these gets triggered. A little blue dot will show whenever it's been pulsed, and you'll see kind of exactly how the data is flowing through everything. And when in doubt, you know my philosophy, break stuff for sure, but play with these values and you'll see how it affects things, and you'll see some interesting behavior if your timing is off with how much you delay stuff. You could see funky stuff happening.